Hello, Ted Morrissey here doing a video for my course for Lindenwood University's MFA in Writing program, specifically my revisionist Shakespeare course. And so this video, I want to talk about Tracy Chevalier's novel New Boy, which as we know is a revision of Shakespeare's play Othello. Right. And I've got another video related to New Boy, which I'm going to encourage you to track down as well. I'll give you a link to it in our online course. But in that video, I do talk a little bit about New Boy specifically, but I actually get more into a discussion of novels that have child either narrators or at least protagonists that are still for adult audiences because they focus on really, adult, sophisticated, complex themes and so forth, which obviously ties into New Boy because it also is a book that has child characters as the focus, but obviously also gets into some very sophisticated adult kinds of issues and so forth. And then in that video, I also talk about other types of revisionist work. And I end up talking about some of my own revisionist work. So I would encourage you to take a look at that as well. But in this video, I thought, you know what, I'll take a little bit deeper dive into New Boy. Obviously, in our discussion posts and in some of the notes that I gave you, we looked at several of the elements that Tracy Chevalier has at work in her novel, and you did an excellent job of kind of seeing the correspondences between characters in Othello and then Tracy Chevalier's characters in New Boy. Obviously, the plot, the basic plot of jealousy and revenge and all those kinds of things are at work in Othello and in New Boy. But I wanted to, like I said, go a little bit further and talk about some things going on in New Boy, which maybe you didn't notice on your first go-around. I probably didn't notice them on my first go-around either. So I wanted to kind of underscore them because I think it is a little more sophisticated treatment of the play that Tracy Chevalier gives us, other than just a sort of basic correspondence between the characters and the plot. Okay. Also, I want to point these things out because as we go forward and are thinking about our own revisionist work, Tracy Chevalier is employing some techniques that we may want to think about as well. Okay, so again, for those of you who are maybe watching this video who aren't part of the course, just to bring it kind of up to speed, again, New Boy is a revisionist work by Chevalier based on Othello, and it has for its focus a group of basically 11-year-olds in an elementary school, particularly on a playground set in the 1970s. And I've mentioned before that I really admire that Tracy Chevalier took those risks. I think a revision of Othello, which does have such heavy sort of themes and things happening in it, to try to retell that play via a group of 11-year-olds on a playground and then to give it a historical context set in the 70s, those are risky narrative choices, and I always give bonus points for risk taking. And so just right off the bat, I give Chevalier points for those kinds of risks. As we know from our discussion board, and as I know from having taught this course a couple times before, some of you love New Boy. You really spoke to you. You found it a great book on so many different levels, whereas others of us, not so much. A couple people didn't really like it at all, and everyone else is sort of on the fence somewhere in between. And that's, I think in part a reflection of the kind of risk taking that Tracy Chevalier is doing here. I think if she had played it a little bit safer in terms of the kind of revision she might have done of Othello, it wouldn't, spread readers across the spectrum from love to not so much so, right? So So those are the basic points of New Boy that we've already kind of talked about. And as I say, I like the fact that it's risk taking. One of the things that we see when we look more closely at the book is that just like the play Othello, which is divided into 5 acts, Tracy Chevalier divides New Boy into 5 sections. And not only that, but if we look at the major plot points, the major action of Othello, what happens in Act 1, what happens in Act 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. I mean, maybe we're to do like a kind of bullet point, a highlight of the different bits of action in those different acts. We would discover that they correspond really closely to the 5 sections of Chevalier's novel New Boy. So I just wanted to kind of give you a few little examples. Not that you don't believe me, but just to back that up a little bit, we have the first section of New Boy, part 1, before school. And we know that in that section, obviously, we're introduced to the characters. And in particular, we're introduced to the fact that D is attracted to Ose, the main character, the Othello counterpart. D obviously being the counterpart to Desdemona. She's attracted to him, and in particular, she starts to already form a sort of devotion to Ose in terms of attaching herself to him, even though a lot of her classmates have this sort of racist response to him because of his being black in essentially an all-white school, or mostly white school. And so even though a lot of her classmates have a sort of natural antipathy, unfortunately, and natural sort of racism, Dee, on the other hand, is attracted to him. And again, exactly as we see in the beginning of Othello in Act 1, we find out that they have been married secretly, Othello and Desdemona. And then as Othello is called away to go to Cyprus because of the impending war, Desdemona out of the character of the time period, she wants to go with him. She is devoted to her husband, and she wants to go to Cyprus with Othello. So again, the specific circumstances, obviously there's no war going on in New Boy, and there's not a journey to Cyprus in New Boy. The attraction, which is considered unusual for the time period, is there, and the devotion is starting to form in New Boy that we definitely see in Othello. So again, happens in Act 1 of Othello. It happens in Part 1 of New Boy. Then we go to Part 2 of New Boy, Morning Recess. And here we are introduced to Ian, and he begins his plotting to get back at the New Boy Ose, and he is upset that Dee is attracted to Ose. And so again, we find that his plans are developing. And in fact, Chevalier tells us on page 90, the very last page of section 2, part 2, Ian smirked as he hurried to catch up with his classmates. He knew now what he would do. So in other words, his plan, which was kind of nebulous up to this point, is forming more concretely. And again, if we look at Act 2 of Othello, we see that Iago, he's got this initial hatred of Othello and is determined to bring him down from the very beginning. But it's really in Act 2 that he starts to manipulate the characters and starts to sort of put a specific plot into action. And so, again, we see this happening in New Boy as well. Part 3 is called Lunch. And in Part 3 of New Boy, obviously lots of things happen, but probably one of the key things that happens is that the pencil case that has the strawberry designs on it, which obviously is reflected in Othello through the handkerchief, that is taken from D, and she is upset that that's happened, but she also feels like that Osei will be upset as well since he gave it to her. And so we're told on page 136, she reached into her bag and came up with nothing. She rummaged around, pushing aside books, a cardigan, a pack of tissues, a little bag of Jacks, no strawberry case. She opened her desk, a lid, knowing it wasn't there, but looking anyway. She could feel O's eyes on her. Okay, so the missing pencil case, which obviously becomes such an important part of Ian's plot, just as the handkerchief is such an important part of Iago's plot. And we're told in Act 3 of Othello, among other things, that Desdemona realizes her handkerchief is missing and that she's very upset about that, and so on. So, again, a very tight correspondence, not just in terms of characters and items, but in the actual sort of chronology and building momentum of the play is also reflected in the novella. Finally, last example here, part 4, afternoon recess. We know, that obviously things start to fall apart in terms of Dee's and Osei's relationship, their 11-year-old romantic relationship, right? But in particular, I liked this feature. We know that in part 4, act 4, I should say, of Othello, one of the things that happens is that Desdemona is kind of haunted by the recollections of a song that her mother's maid used to sing about infidelity and trouble with relationships and all those kinds of things. And Chevalier works that idea into part 4 through singing. We're told, for example, on page 170, Mimi remained seated after they had gone inside, waiting for Roberta to finish singing out her pain, wondering what the next song would be and if it would provide a sign. A little bit later, when Dr. John began to sing about being in the right place at the wrong time, Mimi nodded. The sign made sense to her. This whole day felt like the wrong time. She couldn't wait for it to be over. So that use of song as a reflection of the emotional turmoil of Desdemona is reflected here through singing in school, etc. So again, a really cool, I think, plot point in both the original play and in the novella, but they're also taking place structurally, in terms of the way the book is developing in correspondence with the play. And then, of course, obviously Act 5, Part 5, Act 5, we know, how that all kind of plays out in correspondence with each other as well, right? So again, it's not just a matter of character names corresponding and obviously character, personality traits going along with that and the sort of basic plot, but Chevalier has gone further and she's looked at each act of Othello, obviously, and looked at how the momentum of the play kind of builds towards its crescendo. And she has constructed a 5-part novella or novel, kind of short novel, that corresponds in terms of that as well. And I think that's a really interesting technique. I think, on the one hand, it maybe makes the adaptation more sophisticated to follow the chronology and the building from Act 1 through Act 5 via Part 1 to Part 5. In some ways, though, it might simplify things because in a sense, what is happening then is we're looking at just a part of the play and kind of adapting it to this new setting and these newly visualized revisionist characters, right? And so we're kind of taking it in smaller chunks, and then the overall whole ends up being essentially the same. And I don't know, obviously, what Chevalier did or how she did it. I don't know if she deliberately took it kind of chunk by chunk by chunk, and if that made it easier for her in some ways, or if her grand scheme was to have the 5 acts of the play correspond with the 5 parts of the novel. Again, I don't know, but in any event, I like it, and I think it's worth considering as well. So if you're working on a revisionist text and the original is divided into X number of parts, think about if you want to kind of follow that pattern and divide your story into the same number of parts and have a sort of correspondence in terms of the chapters, sections, whatever they are, and the plotting of your story as well. All right, just a couple of little things I want to point out here, and then I'll end this video so it's not too terribly long. One is we notice that at the beginning of each part in Chevalier's novel, there is a sort of epigraph. And she draws, especially from sort of childhood, rhyming, like playground rhyming and songs kids might play, especially to kind of get under each other's skin and that kind of thing. And obviously that's very cool because it sort of bolsters the setting and the mood that she is trying to create in her novel. But I just want to point out the fact that each section does have its own epigraph. I think oftentimes we consider an epigraph something that's at the very beginning of a book, but then we don't follow through and have quotes, epigraphs, epigrams, whatever you want to call them, for each little section of the book. But we can. So as you're working on it doesn't obviously have to be a revisionist text. Any kind of text can have epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter, each section, however you want to think of it, right? So I thought that was very cool. And then the last point I want to make, which I really, really like, is that Chevalier brings some Shakespeare directly into her text, right? And so she gives a nod to the bard. We know that part 3 opens with Miss Lode, Lode, sharing a spelling list with her students, and that she takes those words directly from Shakespeare. And we get abhor, gnaw, chaos, honest knave, monkey, subtle, sword, tongue, wretch. And then the students comment on, kind of the weirdness of the words and those kinds of things. And I would go further and say not only is this a nod to Shakespeare, kind of bringing him into her play, as kind of a homage of some sort, but also I think if we looked at those specific words, I think we could find some correspondences with things that are happening in New Boy, either via the action or at least the mood of the story. The word monkey obviously jumps out because that's one of the things that Osei talks about, that white kids call him, being black and from Africa and those kinds of things. All right. So I just really like that. So in a revisionist text, I too like to definitely have a sort of nod to the original and so on. All right. So those are just a few things I wanted to point out about New Boy. I think it's a more sophisticated treatment of Othello than what we might gather on a first reading. And so I just wanted to give you some things to think about there. I'd be curious to know your thoughts on either the sophistication of the structure of the novel when we kind of hold it up against Othello, or this idea of bringing the bard into the revisionist text himself, or just this idea of having epigraphs kind of throughout the whole book and not just at the very beginning. All right, so I'll stop there and I will see you down the digital trail.